The first thing you should know is that silver doesn't move like a normal commodity. Oil has pipelines, wheat has silos, chips have fabs. Silver has something else. It has silence. It disappears into products so small you can see it, and so essential you can replace it. It vanishes into solder joints, contact points, conductive inks, and microscopic highways of electricity that make modern life feel effortless. And when it vanishes, it doesn't come back on schedule. Not like copper, not like aluminum. Silver is the kind of metal that gets consumed, scattered, diluted into the physical world like ink spilled into the ocean. That is why the story begins not with a mine, but with a map. A map of flows, a map of ports, a map of exchange vaults, a map of who is quietly pulling metal out of the free float, and who is waking up too late to the fact that available is not the same as for sale. Because when a nation starts treating a commodity like a strategic organ, the market doesn't explode immediately. It tightens first, like a throat, and then it screams. Silver is wearing two masks at once. It is an industrial metal, a working metal, a metal with fingerprints on it. But it is also a monetary metal, a narrative metal, a metal that can absorb fear and broadcast it. That dual identity is what makes it lethal in geopolitics. It can be bought for factories or bought for panic, and from the outside, the buying looks the same. You only feel the difference when delivery times stretch, when premiums detach, when inventories fall and nobody can explain why the shelves look full but the back room is empty. The Silver Institute put hard numbers on what many executives only whispered about in hallways. Industrial demand climbed again, reaching a record 680.5 million ounces in 2024. 4 record years in a row. Not a spike, a regime change. The report also describes a structural deficit that doesn't heal with one good mining quarter, because the market has been drawing down year after year, with 2024 alone showing a deficit of 148.9 million ounces, and a multi-year cumulative deficit large enough to equal 10 months of global mine supply. 10 months. That's not a tight market. That's a missing season. Now picture the silver market like a city reservoir. The mines are rainfall. Recycling is a handful of tanker trucks. Industry is the population drinking every day. And investment demand is the wildfire that can show up overnight, demanding everything at once. If the reservoir is low, a small fire doesn't just burn trees, it empties the water. That is the hidden mechanism. The market can look stable until the moment it cannot, because the visible price is not the same thing as the invisible stockpile. Price is the thermostat on the wall. Inventory is the blood in the body. One can lie, the other can't. And the blood was draining. Now we pan to China, not as a headline, as a machine. China is not just a buyer of commodities. China is a builder of systems, and systems don't like uncertainty. A system that plans solar build-outs, grid expansions, EV scale, consumer electronics, and data centers cannot afford to have a critical conductor become a hostage to overseas inventory cycles. So China does what systems do. It reduces dependence, it pulls inputs closer, it treats supply like national security without ever needing to say the words out loud. And the clue isn't in speeches, it's in arbitrage. In May, analysts were already warning that Chinese imports could surge because local demand was pushing Shanghai prices above world prices, widening an arbitrage window that made it profitable to ship metal into China. And that flow, if sustained, doesn't just increase Chinese supply, it drains the West's free float. It vacuums the margin metal, the tradable metal, the metal that paper markets assume will always appear when futures contracts need to settle. Oni strategist put it bluntly, a wave of imports into China would drain the free float away from the West even further. Free float is one of those phrases that sounds like finance jargon until you translate it into something human. Free float is the silver that isn't already married. It's the metal, not locked into long-term industrial supply agreements, not trapped in products, not sitting in private vaults as a generational hedge, not sitting inside state-linked inventory programs, not already promised to somebody who will sue you if you reroute it. Free float is the dating pool, and the dating pool was shrinking. At the same time, the solar story turned from growth sector into silver sink. Not because solar is the only driver, but because solar has the perfect combination of traits to weaponize silver demand. It is massive in scale, relentless in deployment, politically subsidized, and intolerant to failure. Solar cells turn light into electrons, but electrons are worthless unless you can collect them efficiently. That's where silver metallization paste comes in, printed onto wafers to carry current with minimal resistance. You can thrift it, you can shave milligrams, but you can't wish away conductivity. And here, the metaphor changes. Silver is not the fuel, silver is the wiring. A country can survive an oil shock by driving less. A factory can survive a copper shock by redesigning. But a wiring shock is different. Wiring is not optional. Wiring is the prerequisite for the entire circuit to exist. That is why the pressure builds even when the silver content per unit falls, because the denominator is exploding. Even if each panel uses less, the world is installing so many panels that total offtake stays brutal. Even if each EV optimizes, total EV volume rises. Even if each device gets smaller, the number of devices rises, and AI infrastructure pulls demand into high-performance niches where good enough metals fail. Now bring Tesla and Samsung into the frame, not as villains, as indicators. Tesla sits at the junction of electrification, storage, and manufacturing scale. Samsung sits at the junction of semiconductors, consumer electronics, and the supply chains that feed modern digitization. These companies don't have the luxury of ideological narratives about metals. They have procurement calendars, they have bill of materials exposure, they have factories that either run or stop. When a procurement desk panics, it doesn't panic on television. It panics in contracts, it panics in prepayments, it panics in longer-term offtake deals. It panics in inventory behavior that looks irrational until you remember one thing: the cost of being wrong is asymmetric. If silver prices rise, you lose margin. If silver disappears, you lose production. Margin is pain, production stoppage is death. So a rational company will overpay to avoid stoppage. That is not emotion, that is math. And math is where this thriller turns into a trap. Because silver supply is inelastic in the short run. Mines cannot double output because executives get nervous. Most silver is produced as a byproduct of other mining. The Silver Institute notes global mine supply around the 800 million ounce range, with 2024 mine production at 819.7 million ounces, and recycling at 193.9 million ounces. That is not a faucet you can open wider tomorrow. It is a slow geological industry with long permitting timelines and capital cycles that move at the speed of bureaucracy. So here's the mechanism, stated cleanly, professor level, no mysticism. When demand rises faster than supply, the market clears in only two ways. Either price rises until some buyers stop buying, or inventories are consumed until there's nothing left to consume. And when inventories are already low, price does the heavy lifting. That is why silver doesn't trend, it snaps. In late 2025, the snap became visible. Silver moved through psychological levels like a battering ram, and the story gained a geopolitical fuse when China signaled export controls requiring licenses starting in 2026. Whether that policy affects refined silver bars, semi-fabricated forms, or specific categories, the market reaction is the same because markets trade expectations before details. A license regime is not just a rule. It is a warning flare that says, this flow can be turned off. And then the headline that turned boardrooms cold arrived. Musk publicly reacted to the export control news by saying it was not good, emphasizing that silver is needed in many industrial processes. That matters not because it's celebrity commentary, but because it confirms what procurement teams were already modeling internally. When the CEO of a flagship manufacturer says the quiet part out loud, it means the internal dashboards are glowing red. Now watch what happens next in the drama, because it's always the same in a shortage. The first phase is denial, the second phase is substitution. The third phase is hoarding, the fourth phase is blame. Substitution sounds heroic until you actually try it. Solar manufacturers can push thrifting, finer lines, improve printing, partial copper blends, even future copper plating pathways. But these are engineering projects, not magical switches, and they often come with yield issues, reliability questions, and retooling costs. A shortage doesn't wait for your R&D roadmap. Meanwhile, hoarding doesn't mean stacks of bars in a government vault, at least not at first. Hoarding begins as prudence. It begins as extending safety stock from 2 weeks to 8. It begins as buying forward. It begins as refusing to sell scrap back into the market because you might need it later. In other words, hoarding begins as 1,000 rational decisions that become one collective irrational outcome, like a crowd running toward the same exit. And that's when the West starts to starve, not because there is no silver on Earth, but because the silver that exists is no longer circulating. Circulation is everything. A metal can exist in abundance and still be unavailable, the same way money can exist in an economy and still fail to reach people if it pools in one place. Economists call that a liquidity trap. Commodity markets have their own version. It's called strategic gravity. Silver falls toward the strongest long-term buyers. The buyers with state backing, the buyers building the next grid, the next factory line, the next industrial dominance cycle. It doesn't leave the West because someone stole it. It leaves because the West assumed the market would always clear smoothly, and China assumed the opposite. Now add one more accelerant, the financial layer. Silver trades on futures markets where paper claims can dwarf physical availability. This is not inherently fraud. Futures are designed for hedging. But when physical tightness rises, the credibility of paper depends on the market's ability to deliver metal when it matters. When the ratio of claims to deliverable inventory becomes uncomfortable, every participant starts asking the same question. If I need physical, will I get it? That question changes behavior immediately. It pulls demand forward. It increases premiums. It widens spreads. Western firms often run lean, optimized for quarterly efficiency, trusting global markets to deliver inputs just in time. That's beautiful in stable times. In strategic times, it's fragility disguised as discipline. So when Tesla panics, when Samsung panic buys, it's not because they are reckless. It's because they can read the same equation every strategist can read. If you wait for silver to become scarce, you will pay a scarcity price. If you wait for your supplier to admit scarcity, you will be last in line. If you wait for governments to coordinate, your factory schedule will collapse first. And when enough giants decide they would rather be early and wrong than late and dead, the buying itself becomes the catalyst. That's the cruel elegance of commodity squeezes. The act of preparing for the storm becomes the storm. In the background, solar keeps pulling, EVs keep pulling, electronics keep pulling, data centers keep pulling, the grid keeps pulling, and the reservoir doesn't refill fast enough. Industrial demand in 2024 wasn't just high, it was structurally high, tied to what the Silver Institute explicitly calls structural gains linked to the green economy and boosted by AI-linked end uses. That's not a fad, that's a new baseline. So now you can feel the thriller logic tightening. A market already in multi-year deficit, a strategic buyer pulling imports through arbitrage, draining free float from the West, exchange inventories falling, a licensing regime hinting that exports can be throttled, executives signaling alarm, investors smelling both fear and upside, every participant looking at the same shrinking exit. When silver hit a record high near 83.62 in late 2025, amid these dynamics, it wasn't just a price print. It was a message. It said the old assumptions are breaking. It said the market is no longer casually liquid. It said the metal is turning from commodity into constraint. Now imagine the next scene. A procurement officer in California watches a quote change between morning and afternoon and realizes the valid for 24 hours line is a joke now. A solar manufacturer in Europe runs simulations and realizes that even aggressive thrifting can tee us outrun installation targets. A semiconductor executive in Korea sees lead times stretching and starts calling refiners directly. A policy advisor in Washington reads export license and hears strategic material, then starts drafting language that will arrive too late. And in China, the machine keeps doing what machines do. It keeps feeding itself. Because hoarding is not a moral concept in this story. It's a survival strategy. If China hoards silver, the West doesn't starve because China is evil. The West starves because it treated strategic supply as a footnote, and footnotes don't keep factories running. The math doesn't care who's righteous. The math only cares who is prepared. If enough of the world decides that silver is no longer just a metal, but a gatekeeper of electrification and digitization, then silver's price doesn't need a conspiracy to climb. It only needs a shortage of slack. And slack is exactly what multi-year deficits erase. So when people whisper $150, they're not worshiping a number. They don't be pointing to a psychological threshold where the market is no longer pricing silver as an input. It is pricing silver as a choke point. At $150, the metal is not being valued for its history as money. It is being valued for its role as the thin film of conductivity holding up the modern world. It is being valued the way you value the last bridge across a river when every army is marching. Whether the market reaches that exact figure or stalls earlier, the direction of the narrative is the same. China hoards, the West starves, not for jewelry, not for coins, for circuits, for panels, for batteries, for the quiet metal that turns